Today we have the top 10 most iconic paintings in history, each of which has simply blown up the art world. Sometimes these are not the most beautiful or the most brilliant works. That makes it even more interesting for you to find out why the art world revolves around them. As always, it will be very interesting. Let's go! First, The Holy Trinity by Masaccio, 1428 Discovery, the third dimension on a flat surface. To understand the scale of the first revolution on our list, you need to imagine how things were before. And before Masaccio, all European painting was mostly icons and frescoes. They were flat with a gold or solid background, and the figures looked as if they were cut out of cardboard and pasted onto the wall. They were all arranged in a single line. You could only guess what was farther away and what was closer to the viewer by seeing how some figures blocked others. The faces are almost identical with no expressions. The Virgin Mary was often depicted 10 times larger than the apostles, not due to size or proximity, but to show her importance. The size of the figure depended not on the distance from the viewer, but on the spiritual importance of the character. Realism, as a principle of painting, was not considered at all. It was entirely controlled by the symbolism of what was shown. Also, one more thing. None of those who painted all this considered themselves artists in our sense. They were craftsmen. They didn't sign their paintings, just as a baker doesn't sign every loaf of bread he makes. That's why we don't know the names of most of the masters from those centuries. A painting was seen as an ordinary commodity, and the patron was usually the church. They received an order, signed a contract, delivered it to the church, got paid, and forgot about it. And so, in Florence, there lived a young craftsman named Tommaso di Deser Giovanni de Simone. He is known to us as Masaccio, which roughly translates as Messy Kid. That was his nickname. He is 20 years old. He is a friend of the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, who just recently, literally in these very years, conducted the first scientific experiment in the history of art. Brunelleschi stood in front of the Florentine baptistery with a mirror and a piece of board and drew the building on the board exactly as he saw it. He made a hole in the center and discovered that all the lines, the pavement, the walls, the roof, converged at one point right at that hole. That's how Brunelleschi discovered and defined perspective mathematically. Perspective, that is, the principle by which objects decrease in visible size as they move away from the viewer. Can you imagine that before this discovery, artists simply didn't notice this pattern? The discovery was so significant that Florentine artists literally went crazy. It's like a magic trick. It turned out that you could create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. It's as if there's a hole in the wall. And Masaccio is the first to fully apply this discovery. He paints the fresco Holy Trinity in the Santa Maria Novella church in Florence and depicts a vaulted niche on a flat wall. Pay attention to the ceiling, that's exactly it. He also depicted columns, an arch, and a coffered ceiling receding several meters into the distance according to the laws of linear perspective. The niche features the crucified Christ, with God the Father behind him, the Virgin Mary and John on the sides, and the fresco's patrons at the entrance. And do you know what happened next? The chronicles of that time preserved a description of the reaction of contemporaries. The parishioners rushed into the church and, not believing their eyes, approached the wall to touch it. They actually suspected that a niche had been carved into the wall, and to make sure it was just a fresco, they felt the columns and looked inside the fresco. It became an attraction, an illusion that crowds came to gawk at. To people in the 15th century, it was a true miracle that defied nature's laws. Remember your first impression of real 3D? That's pretty much how they felt too. Masaccio unfortunately did not live to see his fame. He died a year after this work at the age of 27 under very mysterious circumstances. There are rumors about poison. But he managed to open the door and everyone immediately rushed through it. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Botticelli. And for the next 500 years, Western painting would compete in one thing. Who could deceive the viewer's eye more convincingly? Who could create such a convincing three-dimensional illusion on a flat surface that the viewer would forget it's just paint on a board or canvas? The illusion of volume would become the main currency of painting and would remain so until the second half of the 19th century, when the Impressionists would finally put an end to this game. The Renaissance began with this fresco, and the next step would be taken by another Florentine who was 100 years ahead of his time. Number 2, Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci, 1503 to 1519. The discovery of Sfumato, a living, breathing surface. 80 years have passed since Masaccio. Artists have mastered linear perspective perfectly. But what comes next? Now they need to learn how to paint living people, not flat dolls with identical faces. And that's when one invention comes to the rescue: oil paints. Before that, they mostly painted with tempera, egg yolk mixed with pigment and water. Tempera dries in an hour. The colors are opaque, and it's impossible to make smooth transitions. To add shadows, you must use a separate brushstroke in a different tone, which will stand out like a patch. The result was a flat cutout effect, but oil paint is pigment mixed with linseed oil. It was discovered in Flanders in the early 15th century, and Jan van Eyck perfected the technique. Oil takes a day to dry. You can thin it so much that the paint becomes almost transparent, and you can apply one translucent layer over another and then another. And you also get depth of color, as light passes through several layers, reflects off the lower ones, and the surface seems to glow from within. And at this moment, a person joins the world of painting whom we now know as the symbol of universal genius: Leonardo da Vinci. He is not only a painter, but also an anatomist. He personally dissects corpses and sketches muscles to understand how the human body moves. He is an engineer, drawing designs for helicopters, parachutes, diving suits, locomotives, and he is also a musician, architect, biologist, and who knows what else. He was interested in so many different things that he simply didn't finish many of his art projects. Fewer than 2 dozen of his works have survived to this day. And so, in 1503, the Florentine merchant Francesco del Giocondo approaches the experimenter Leonardo. He wanted to commission a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini, an ordinary request. Leonardo takes on the job and begins to implement a recently invented technique, but he never gives the painting to the client. He worked on it for 16 years, experimenting with the paint composition, carrying it with him everywhere, to Milan, to Rome, and eventually to France, where he was invited by King Francis I. There he died in 1519, and the Mona Lisa remained in the royal collection, which is why today it is in the Louvre, not in Italy. What was Leonardo doing with the painting all those 16 years? He applied up to dozens of semi-transparent layers of paint to the painting, each layer thinner than a human hair. After each layer, the painting would dry, and Leonardo would choose the next shade between the layers. He would blend the edges with his finger or a special soft brush so that it was impossible to see where one area ended and another began. There wasn't a single sharp line, only soft, smoky transitions. Leonardo was the first to invent the technique of a perfect gradient, so delicate that we can't perceive the exact boundary where one shade transitions into another. He called this technique sfumato, from the Italian word for smoky. That's why Mona Lisa seems to be covered with a haze. And the smile looks so soft because the corners of her mouth are painted using the sfumato technique, and you can't really tell where the smile begins. The boundary between the face and the background is blurred, and this gives her an air of mystery. Before Leonardo, no one knew how to paint a lifelike face. Typical portraits before that were masks with correct proportions, without emotions, meant simply to capture a person's likeness and hang it on the wall. Each portrait took months to paint. Sitting and smiling that long was impossible. Leonardo was the first to paint emotion. On the canvas, it's not just a face, but the mood of the subject, their inner state. And it was this that turned an ordinary portrait of a merchant's wife into the most famous painting on the planet. And a bit of scandal, of course. Until 1911, Mona Lisa wasn't even considered a particularly important painting until it was stolen from the Louvre. Mona Lisa made it to the front pages of newspapers all over the world and became a star of the society pages. She became bigger than any star before her. I discussed this theft in another video. Check it out via the link in the description. After Mona Lisa, the era of the High Renaissance begins. Raphael, Titian's school, Rigia, all of them master sfumato. The psychological portrait becomes possible as a genre, not just a document showing what a person looks like, but an artistic statement about a person. And this will become the main area of development in painting for the next 3 centuries. Number 3, The Death of Germanicus by Nicolas Poussin, 1627, the beginning of Classicism. The rules that will last for 200 years. Our next painting didn't break the rules, but rather set them in place for a whole 200 years. That's why I decided to include it in the list. Without it, our arc of artistic revolution would be incomplete. Let's move forward another 100 years. The Counter-Reformation is raging in Europe. The Catholic Church, having lost half its flock because of Luther and the Protestants, who made asceticism part of their creed and declared the Catholic Church's excessive wealth a sin, is desperately fighting for the remaining half. How can they keep their parishioners? And the Catholics decide to go the opposite way and create propaganda of luxury as a counterbalance to boring asceticism, to give the potential audience drama, ecstasy, and emotion. And that's how Baroque art emerges. It's the art of shock and excess. Caravaggio illuminates his saints with harsh theatrical beams, as if from a spotlight, and Rubens paints lush, full-bodied women. The compositions are twisted into whirlwinds, fabrics flow, hands are raised in supplication, and faces show extreme emotions. The entire church in Italy, Flanders, and Spain works in this style. And time goes on. The reserved, withdrawn, unsociable Frenchman Nicolas Poussin. There will be a video about him soon. Subscribe so you don't miss it. He moved. He moved from Normandy to Rome at 30 and lived there nearly his whole life. A bookworm and a lover of antiquity, he couldn't stand the noise of the Baroque. He rarely accepted commissions for large churches on principle. For him, it was too ostentatious. Poussin believed that art should teach, not excite, and he chose his clients among educated collectors, scholars, and cardinals with libraries. In 1627, Cardinal Francesco Barberini approached him. To create the painting, Poussin chose a subject from antiquity. Germanicus was the nephew of Emperor Tiberius, a brilliant Roman general, beloved by all, but now he is envied and suspected of wanting to take the throne. And as soon as Germanicus returns from his campaign in Syria, he suddenly dies, almost certainly poisoned, by order of Tiberius himself. Before his death, Germanicus gathers his companions and makes them swear an oath to avenge him. This is the kind of scene where an unknown artist would have filled it with screams, tears, distorted faces, hands flung upward, and drapery blowing in the wind. But what does Poussin do? Look at this painting and compare it to any Baroque painting next to Poussin's. Everything is measured, the composition is symmetrical, like an ancient temple. The Germanicus lies exactly in the center. His wife and companions are arranged on the sides, like statues in niches. The gestures are noble and restrained. No hysteria, no tears, no torn clothes, only stoic grief. The colors are muted, the background is classical Roman architecture. This is Classicism in its pure, concentrated form. Poussin basically wrote a textbook on what a proper painting should look like. A painting that educates the viewer. And you know what happened next? This textbook would remain in force for the next 200 years. In 1648 in France, after Poussin's death, King Louis XIV founded the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, the world's first state-run art school. And what will artists be taught at this academy? Poussin's principles. For the next 200 years, the entire European academic tradition would take his paintings as the standard. And right up until the mid-19th century, until the Impressionists themselves, just wait for them. In Europe, only what matches the canon established in this painting is considered real painting. Namely, grand historical subjects, noble poses, perfect composition, and invisible brushwork. Everything else, landscape, portrait, genre scene, is considered second-rate. It's only suitable for apprentices at best. It would take artists 235 years to break this canon, and it would be done by two Frenchmen, Edouard Manet and Claude Monet. And now you will stop confusing them forever. The next two masterpieces are about them. Number 4, Luncheon on the Grass, Edouard Manet, 1863. Discovery. The first major crack in academicism. For more than 200 years, Poussin's canon remained rock solid. Paintings were created in studios from memory. The subjects were only mythological, biblical, or military. Shadows had to follow strict rules, and brushstrokes were invisible. The Paris Salon, the main exhibition in Europe, ruthlessly rejected anything that didn't fit the mold. But by the 1860s, dissatisfaction was growing. Dozens of young artists had been trying for years to get into the Salon, and year after year, their works were rejected for not following the rules. And in 1863, the Academy became completely brazen. It rejected 3,000 paintings out of the 5,000 submitted. The outrage was so great that it reached Emperor Napoleon III. He visits the Salon, reviews the rejected paintings, and orders a separate Salon of the rejected for them. And at this Salon of the rejected, at the first Salon of the rejected, the public will see a painting that will make Parisian society simply rise up in outrage. In the painting, two dressed men in modern suits are sitting on the grass. With them is a naked woman, not a nymph, not a goddess, but some Parisian woman from the next courtyard. She sits with her chin resting on her hand, relaxed, and looks straight at the viewer boldly, without embarrassment. In the background, another woman in just a shirt splashes in the stream. A picnic basket and discarded clothes lie nearby. You might think, so what? But let's try for a moment to get into the mind of an average Parisian in 1863. In the Salon, as elsewhere, there isn't a single Parisian master. Venus, Susanna, bathing nymphs, Psyche, Leda with the swan, all of them, according to myths, walked around naked, which is why there are thousands of academic paintings like that. They hang in the Louvre and no one cares. But nearby, a naked woman splashing around in just a shirt, in ordinary clothes of the era, with ordinary men in ties, that's already considered some kind of pornography, scandalously unacceptable. And what's especially important is that Manet didn't come up with this woman's pose out of his own imagination. He literally copied it from erotic photographs that were circulating widely in Paris in the 1850s. Photography was a novelty at the time. The exposure time was finally reduced to a second, and studio portrait photography appeared. And one of its first mass functions, of course, was, yes, that's right, that very one. It was completely inappropriate, but imagine that for the first time, not paintings, but real images of living people appeared on the market, very often without clothes. There was such a boom that in London, they even passed the first law in history against pornography, trying to stop this photographic depravity. So Parisians could only secretly buy pictures of nude models from photographers. And Monet, an avid collector of photographs in general, and erotic photography in particular, brought this recognizable visual image straight to the canvas. And most Parisians knew the subject, but they couldn't admit it. That's why these hypocrites lashed out at the technical side of the issue, which was actually the real revolution. Look at this painting carefully. For academics, for any student of Poussin, the figure is always painted with proper light and shadow. There is light, there are midtones, there is deep shadow, the transitions are smooth, the volume is tangible, the body should be sculpted on the canvas, but Monet has almost no shadows. The woman's body is painted almost without modeling, as if she is pasted onto the landscape like an applique, standing out as a bright spot against the dark foliage. To contemporary critics, this seemed unfinished, dirty, the work of an unskilled apprentice. But Monet simply painted the way the eye sees in bright daylight, when the shadows are short, contrasting, and almost merge with the body itself. No academic embellishment. This was the first serious attempt to abandon Poussin's rules in the very technique of painting. The subject was more of a very high-profile publicity stunt, but it brought the artist more problems than benefits. The Parisian critics tore him apart. The newspaper Figaro wrote that this is a canvas without form or color, without draftsmanship, and without any idea. One critic called the painting an ugly farce. In 2 years, Monet will paint an even more scandalous Olympia, which will even make its way into the official salon. See more about this in my video about Edouard Manet. It was after luncheon on the grass that the first major crack appeared in academicism. And through this crack, a whole crowd will pour in, the future Impressionists, Post-Impressionists, all of modern art. Number 5. Impression, Sunrise, Claude Monet, 1872. A discovery, a new language of painting, brushstroke, moment, reflected light. If Manet opened the door, then Monet walked through it, tore down the old decor, and created his own design. Here, too, an interesting twist awaits us. This is how it happened. The painting Impression, Sunrise itself, to be honest, is far from Monet's best work. The canvas was painted in a few sessions at the port of Le Havre, Monet's hometown. Morning mist, orange sun on the water, a couple of boats, silhouettes, and smoky factory chimneys in the background. The brushstroke is loose and sweeping. Monet had painted this way for 10 years, with even stronger works, Paris scenes, Seine views, and portraits of his wife. But it is this one that will go down in history. Let me explain why. By the early 1870s, a group of young artists had gathered around Claude Monet. For years, they had tried to get into the Paris Salon, and for years, the Academy had rejected them. Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, Alfred Sisley, Berthe Morisot, Paul Cézanne, the future classics of Impressionism. But for now, just a gang of penniless experimental artists. And in 1873, they decide, that's it, enough. Let's put on our own exhibition without the Academy, without a jury, without those stupid rules. They rent photographer Nadar's studio on Boulevard des Capucines. The exhibition opened on April 15, 1874. It featured 30 artists and 165 works. For comparison, the Paris Salon limited artists to 3 works per person. Here, there were no restrictions. But the public mostly came to gawk and laugh. For them, new art was anything that deviated from the canons of classicism. It was considered daubing, the bad antics of nameless upstarts who couldn't paint. The critics joked. The method of these artists is like this. A pistol is loaded with tubes of paint and fired at the canvas. And Louis Leroy stood out in particular. A critic from the satirical magazine Le Charivari, he wrote a caustic satirical column in the form of a dialogue between two visitors, an elderly conservative master and a young enthusiast. The old man, upon seeing Monet's work Impression Sunrise, sarcastically remarks, "Impression? Well, yes, of course, I'm sure of it. Since I'm impressed, there must be an impression here. And what free and easy execution, wallpaper in the initial stage of the pattern, looks more like a painting than this seascape." And Leroy disdainfully calls this whole group impressionists if you like. A feuilleton is published in the magazine under the title The Impressionists Exhibition, and this sarcastic nickname stuck. At first, the young rebels shunned it, but gradually they got used to it and made it their banner. In fact, the painting didn't even have an original title. It was simply a view of the port in Le Havre. But Monet had to come up with it specifically for the exhibition. If he hadn't done that, today we might well be talking not about Impressionists, but about Havrists. That's how the painting Impression Sunrise, which accidentally became a reason for ridicule, turned into the symbol of an entire movement that changed the art world. What made the technique innovative? I'll highlight three key things. First, the visible separate brushstroke. Before the Impressionists, in Classicism, artists tried to make brushstrokes invisible and smooth. That was considered a sign of mastery. For the Impressionists, it becomes the main feature of the painting, the basic building block of the composition. You can see exactly how the paint is applied, its shape and direction. The brushstroke becomes an independent unit of expression, adding dynamism to the painting. Second, a moment instead of a pose, not an eternal composition, measured with a ruler and painted in a studio under artificial light, but a specific 2-minute moment in a specific place in specific light, out in the open air. Impressionists paint in the moment. Manet went so far as to carry 9 to 12 easels outdoors at once and switch between them every hour because the light kept changing. That's exactly how he painted his famous haystacks. He has famous series like the Rouen Cathedral, Poplars, and Haystacks, where he painted the same subject in different lighting exactly in this way. Third, reflected light. The shadow is no longer black, it has color. The color of the light and the surrounding objects tint the object with their own hues. Snow under the setting sun is pink. A face in the shade of a tree looks greenish. Pure color in general can only exist when it is surrounded by nothing but white, for example, in a white room. That's why any object in a natural environment is always colored by the reflection of the colors of nearby objects and the color of the light. The Impressionists made this idea a rule, which later spread to Post-Impressionism and beyond. This completely turns painting upside down. After Impressionism, everyone will paint differently. Louis Leroy came up with the name for one of the main revolutions in art history as a joke. You can learn more about Impressionism in my separate video. Be sure to watch it, it's super interesting. Number 6. A Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. Georges Seurat. 1884-1886 discovery. Pointillism. Color mixes not on the palette, but in the eye. Only 12 years have passed since Impressionism. Impressionism is halfway to recognition from the public and critics, but innovative artists recognized it long ago. And then, at the Parisian Salon, a young Parisian named Georges Seurat appears. He is 24 years old. And he is not an artist in the usual sense at all. Seurat isn't part of the bohemian crowd. He doesn't drink, cause trouble, or struggle with poverty. A young man from a respectable bourgeois family, he has a solid engineering education and is pedantic, methodical, and serious. He is more of a scientist than a painter. He reads scientific works on optics, studies the color theory of the chemist Michel-Eugène Chevreul, who invented the color wheel. Chevreul worked as the director of the tapestry manufactory and noticed that threads of different colors, when placed next to each other, blend from a distance and give the viewer a third color. If you look at the tapestry up close, it's just knots of threads, yellow, blue, red, green. But from a distance, the eye blends them together and sees complex shades. Chevreul described all of this mathematically and published a scientific book in 1839 about the law of simultaneous color contrast. Hundreds read the book, but only Seurat truly understood it among the artists and drew a completely crazy conclusion from it. He says, "Why mix paints on the palette? If I put blue and yellow dots next to each other on the canvas, your eye will blend them and see green." If you've ever seen a TV or monitor screen up close, then you know exactly what Seurat meant. Any color image on a screen is made up of millions of tiny red, green, and blue RGB dots. They don't physically mix, they glow separately, and your brain merges them into a single image. So, Seurat came up with exactly this idea 80 years before the color TV appeared and 100 years before the digital screen. Only his pixels weren't electronic but dots of paint. If Seurat had lived to see the invention of television, he would have been very happy. I think he wouldn't have been surprised at all. And he takes a huge canvas, 2 by 3 meters, and for 2 years, from 1884 to 1886, he methodically fills it with millions of colored dots. The scene is Parisians enjoying a leisurely Sunday in the park on the island of Grand Jatte on the Seine. Men in top hats, ladies with parasols, mothers with children, people playing with dogs, rowers on the river. At first glance, it's an ordinary bourgeois scene. In reality, it's an optical experiment. This is not Impressionism. Impressionists painted quickly, capturing the moment with broad brushstrokes. Seurat paints slowly, methodically, scientifically. He even rejects the brushstroke itself. The brushstroke disappears, leaving only the dot. All forms are constructed from thousands of tiny dots of pure pigment, arranged strictly according to Chevreul's theory. Each dot is precisely calculated. When Seurat first showed the painting to the public at the Society of Independent Artists exhibition in 1886, the reaction was mixed. The Impressionists reacted coldly to it, seeing it as sterile and mechanical. Critics called the technique confetti on canvas. One of his contemporaries wrote that the figures in the painting looked like Egyptian hieroglyphs, frozen, motionless, lifeless, and actually that's partly true. Seurat had to sacrifice dynamism for the sake of optical accuracy. Yes, you can see for yourself that the painting looks more like a frozen puppet theater. This new technique was called Pointillism, from the French word point, meaning dot, or more precisely, divisionism, from division, meaning separation. It had followers like Paul Signac and Henry Cross, but it never became a mainstream style. It was too labor-intensive, too tedious. You could spend all summer making dots or finish a painting each day instead. And I wouldn't say that this painting was revolutionary, but it is undoubtedly an important and very interesting stage in the development of painting. Seurat died 5 years after La Grande Jatte at the age of 31 from meningitis. He was very young. With him, Pointillism almost faded away as an independent movement. But the idea that he was the first to introduce into painting that color is not a property of the object, but an optical phenomenon in the viewer's eye, changed the understanding of color for all artists. After Seurat, the artist stops being a slave to an object's real color. If color is not tied to the object, sooner or later someone will say, then why do we need the object at all? And that someone will appear soon. In 20 years, Kandinsky will paint the first completely abstract painting. Pointillism turned out to be a short but extremely important step toward abstraction. Number 7. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso. 1907 discovery. It is now allowed to break the object itself. Another 20 years passed, during which artists, after the revolution of Impressionism, who had set out to invent and try every possible technique of depicting objects, ended up breaking everything. The subject matter was broken by Monet. The Impressionists upended brushwork and light. Seurat, the Fauves, and Matisse upended color, who by that time was already painting faces green. But there was one thing no one ever touched, the object itself. A violin in a painting was still a violin. A horse was a horse. A face was a face. You could depict them in a new way, simplify them, distort them, color them with impossible colors, but the recognizability of the object remains sacred. And then a 26-year-old Spaniard arrives in Paris without money, without fame, but with wild ambitions, Pablo Picasso. He lived for years in a shabby studio in Montmartre's famous Bateau Lavoir building, which means Bateau Lavoir. В переводе «корабль прачечная». It's a dilapidated wooden house, without heating, without any amenities. The rooms upstairs are crawling with bedbugs. And downstairs was an impoverished bohemian crowd, poets and adventurers. And Picasso decides to paint a picture that will outdo everyone. The subject is a brothel on Avignon Street in his hometown of Barcelona. 5 naked women waiting for a client. It's not about shock value. It's been almost 50 years since Edouard Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, and by that time, everyone in Paris was already used to naked ladies on canvas. The point is how to paint them. Picasso, like all artists of that time, was desperately searching for new forms to forge his own direction in painting, just like Manet, Matisse, and Cézanne. And then he comes across two Iberian stone statuettes. They were brought to him by Géry Perrier, a petty crook who sold them to the artist for 50 francs each. How could Picasso have known that Perrier had stolen these statuettes from the Louvre? Back then, security at the Louvre was terrible. There were no alarms yet, and such petty thieves often made a living by stealing items from the museum. 4 years later, the Mona Lisa was stolen from there, so imagine how easy it was to steal statuettes that could fit under a coat. Picasso saw a new style in the statuettes and used them as models for the faces of the three women on the left in his future painting. He painted the faces of the two women on the right using African ritual masks, which fascinated the entire Parisian avant-garde at the time after the French opened the Trocadero Ethnography Museum. The result is horrifying. The women's noses point one way while their eyes look another. One eye is shown from the front, the other in profile. The bodies are carved with angular planes as if made of stone. This doesn't look like anything that came before at all. Picasso calls his friends to look at the painting. The reaction was devastating. Matisse was furious. He considered the painting a personal insult, a provocation against his own artistic pursuits. Braque said to Picasso, "It's like making us swallow tow and drink kerosene." Picasso's art dealer turns around and leaves. Picasso's lover, Fernanda, is crying. Gertrude Stein stands silently in shock. Picasso encroached on the sacred, on the recognizability of the subject in painting. He didn't just present another experiment with painting technique, brush strokes, color, dots, rays. He changed the subject itself. In this case, 5 completely naked figures. Picasso, after such a reaction from his friends, rolls up the women of Avignon and keeps them in his studio for 9 years. The painting will be shown publicly for the first time only in 1916, and here is an important but very inconvenient fact for the popular story. It's commonly said that Picasso invented Cubism with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, but that's not entirely true. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon are not yet Cubism. It's a shock, it's the first blow to form, the permission to break it, but it's not yet a system. Cubism was truly created between 1908 and 1916 by Georges Braque, a friend and rival of Picasso, the very same one who was initially outraged by the painting. Braque went to the retrospective of Paul Cézanne at the Autumn Salon in 1907. Cézanne had just died, and Paris organized a big exhibition. I literally just released a video about Cézanne recently. Be sure to check it out. And at this exhibition, Braque saw Cézanne's latest landscapes, where he broke everything down into geometric blocks, mountains, houses, trees. Cézanne spent his whole life moving toward the idea that the world consists of cylinders, spheres, and cones, and in his latest works, this idea becomes very apparent. Braque was amazed. He went to L'Estaque, a village near Marseille, Cézanne's favorite place for landscapes, and painted a series of works there: houses, rocks, trees. Everything is broken down into simple geometric volumes. The critic Louis Vauxelles wrote in his review of Braque's exhibition at the Kahnweiler Gallery in November 1908, "Mr. Braque is a bold man who despises form, reducing all places, figures, houses to geometric schemes, to cubes." That's how the word Cubism was born, from Braque, from Cézanne. And of course, that's upsetting for the cult of Picasso, but it's a historical fact. After that, Braque and Picasso worked together as a pair. They literally lived in neighboring studios. They visited each other every day, argued, and came up with new ideas. As they said, like two climbers tied with one rope. Every day they dressed the same, like two workers, and every day they went down to their studios to work on building Cubism. In 5 years, it had grown into a strong established movement. Bonus track to this story. In 1911, when the Mona Lisa herself is stolen from the Louvre, Picasso will become the main suspect in the theft, because he still had those same stolen statuettes in his closet. His friend Apollinaire had a couple more. In a panic, Apollinaire packs a suitcase with the statuettes, disguises himself so he can't be recognized, rumor has it, in women's clothing, though that might just be an urban legend. He visits the Paris Journal's editorial office, gives the statuettes to journalists, who then return them to the Louvre. Apollinaire is still arrested and kept in jail for a week. Picasso is summoned for questioning. According to contemporaries, he cried and denied even knowing Apollinaire. This deeply hurt his friend. I told this story in detail in my video about the theft of the Mona Lisa and in my video about Picasso. Be sure to watch those as well. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and Houses at L'Estaque opened the last door in painting. And to be honest, I wouldn't have opened that door. Well, just cracked it open a little. Now anything is possible. If an object can be dissected, then in a few steps it will be possible to abandon it altogether. And the next hero of our story will do just that. Number 8, Composition 7, Vasily Kandinsky, year 1913. Discovery, non-objectivity. The Cubists broke the object apart but kept it recognizable. That was their thing. How far can you go in decomposing an object so that it still remains recognizable? Recognizability was still a basic principle, and then a Russian comes onto the scene to take the next step. He removes the object from the painting entirely, completely. On the canvas, there is only color, shape, and rhythm. No violin, no face, no houses, no hints of the real world. Vasily Kandinsky is called the father of abstraction. His biography is highly unusual for a great artist. He is a lawyer. He graduated from Moscow University. He defended a dissertation on the economics of peasant labor. He taught in Derpt. He had a successful academic career. He was on the path to becoming a professor. And at the age of 30, suddenly, in 1896, he gives it all up. He turns down a professorship in Derpt and goes to Munich to study painting. It was considered late for those times, almost hopeless. His wife was in shock, his parents were horrified, but Kandinsky was persistent. What happened? 2 shocks. The first was in Moscow, at an exhibition of French Impressionists, where he saw Claude Monet's haystacks. And he didn't immediately recognize that it was haystacks. At first, he only saw a spot of color and the haystack. Сначала увидел только цветовое пятно. He realized color can be a subject in its own right without an object. The second revelation, a production of Wagner's opera Lohengrin at the Bolshoi Theater. Kandinsky said he heard sounds as colors, saw them in the air. This medical phenomenon is called synesthesia. In some people, sounds and colors are directly connected in the brain. And Kandinsky thought, if music is pure abstraction, not telling any story, but simply existing as sound, then painting can be the same. It can be created like music. In Munich, Kandinsky gradually comes to this idea. In the early years, he still paints recognizable subjects: horsemen, churches, horses, German landscapes in the style of German folk prints. But by 1910, these subjects on his canvases begin to dissolve into patches of color. At first, you can make out a horseman, but only patches are visible. Then even the patches lose their connection to reality. In 1911, he writes a manifesto about the spiritual in art, a book in which he formulates that color and form have their own resonance, like sounds in music. Blue is calmness, gold is glory, red is anger. An artist can combine them like a composer combines notes without any subject. And in November 1913, in his Munich studio, Kandinsky painted Composition 7 in 4 days. Compare that to 16 years for the Mona Lisa. Before that, there were more than 30 sketches, watercolors, studies, experiments. The canvas is huge, almost 2 by 3 meters, and on it there is only color, form, and rhythm. Whirls, spots, curves, contrasting planes, swift lines, no objects, none at all. Absolutely. Contemporaries looked at it and didn't understand anything at all. The reaction was something like, "What is this? Did a child in kindergarten paint this? Is this even a painting or just a ruined canvas?" All right, 6 years ago we laughed at Cézanne, but this is just some scribbles. That's the very phrase you've probably heard even nowadays. Or maybe you've even thought, I could paint that myself. And you know what? Technically, yes, you can. I can too. Anyone can. But no one thought of it before Kandinsky. That's the essence of a discovery. Once the idea has come to mind, it's easy to repeat it. Before that, it's impossible. That's a recurring theme throughout our story. Each of these discoveries, once made, seems so obvious. But before the discovery, the whole world turns out to be completely blind until someone sharp-eyed comes along. And one more important detail. Kandinsky, unlike many of his followers, was a serious artist. He spent years moving toward abstraction, passed through every stage of figurative art, studied theory, and wrote 2 books, On the Spiritual in Art and Point and Line to Plane. This was not the stunt of a lazy poser. It was a hard-earned intellectual position. After Composition 7, art reached a new level that had previously been inaccessible, complete abstraction. You could paint just forms, just color, just emotion, without a storyline. 2 years later, Another Russian, Kazimir Malevich, would pick up this idea and turn it into a manifesto. Number 9. Black Square, Kazimir Malevich, 1915. Discovery. Art doesn't have to be beautiful. Kandinsky freed art from the obligation to depict something. Malevich goes further. He frees art from the obligation to please, to be beautiful. I know how you feel about the black square, but technically and historically, this is probably the biggest shift in the last 500 years described in our top 10. Let me explain everything now. Look, here's what's important to understand. Kandinsky painted in an abstract way, but still beautifully. The colors are rich, the composition is well thought out, and there's harmony. His abstractions have an aesthetic, maybe unusual, but still recognizable. You can look at Composition 7 and get pure decorative pleasure from it. And Malevich, with his black square, is basically telling the viewer, forget about beauty. I don't want to please you. I'm making a manifesto. Zero form, the end of depicting objects. A black rectangle on a white background. This is a very important shift. Since the times of ancient Greece, the goal of art was to create beauty. For thousands of years, artists competed to see whose goddesses were more beautiful, whose bodies were more graceful, whose colors were more noble. Malevich was the first to say, beauty is not necessary. The main idea. The black square is not some kind of blackness of the cosmos or a point in space. It's just a black square. As a shape and color, it's the exact opposite of the most lively thing in the world, the round yellow sun. Malevich is an extraordinary figure, illiterate, someone who failed the entrance exams to the Moscow School of Painting 4 times. He called himself unlettered, vain, ambitious, endlessly envious of the masters. He tried every style one after another, Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, Primitivism, all just to finally make a name for himself. It didn't work out for a while. He stayed in the background. And then, in 1915, a brilliantly simple idea came to him, to paint a pure form without any subject. Black square. He painted the square in the summer of 1915 and immediately fell into a panic. Anyone can copy the idea, anyone can draw a black square and say, I was the first. And Malevich closes his studio, lets no one in, works behind curtained windows, and backdates the painting to 1913, 2 years earlier, just to be sure. He's also planning a major PR campaign. He comes up with the name Suprematism from the Latin supremus, meaning the highest, that is, the most important above all. He writes a manifesto and arranges for an exhibition. In December 1915, at the 010 exhibition in Petrograd, Malevich stages a spectacle worthy of the best modern marketing. He hangs the black square in the red corner, where icons once hung in Russian homes instead of on the wall. The hint is clear. My painting is a new icon, a new religion of art. Everyone was in shock. He positions his friend, artist Ivan Puni, at the exhibition entrance. He hands out brochures with his manifesto and literally leads visitors by the elbow into Malevich's hall, past the other participants. Malevich himself runs around the exhibition, inviting critics. The painting has 4 levels of protection against copying. Malevich built them in on purpose. The sides of the square are not parallel. It's not a square, but a slightly skewed quadrilateral that no one can accidentally replicate. The black is not a pigment, but a unique mixture of paints that also cannot be exactly reproduced. Under the black layer, there's another colored image hidden, which was finally seen through X-rays 6 years ago. And in the corner, there's an inscription referring to its humorous predecessor. For more details on these features, watch my full video about the black square. The link is in the description. This painting and the publicity around it changed art forever. Of course, the black square wasn't accepted right away, but after the black square, the artist was no longer required to be pleasant. And that's mutual, you have to admit. He doesn't have to please the eye. He can challenge, provoke, deny, shock, and it will be considered art, and it will sell. By the way, this opened up huge opportunities for charlatanism. If there's no need to create beauty anymore, then skill essentially isn't needed either. And for many modern and so-called artists, this would be very convenient. Next, there will be a whole army of people who claim to express an idea, but in reality, they just don't know how to draw. And on my channel, you will definitely learn to distinguish an empty shell from real art. Join me. Malevich eventually opened the final door, which in my opinion leads to the land of shadows. In 2 years, a person will enter it who will say, actually, there's no need to draw anything at all. Number 10, Fountain by Marcel Duchamp, 1917. a revelation. The artist no longer has to create anything with his own hands. And here we are at the most controversial painting in our top 10, and perhaps in the history of art. Although I should clarify right away, this isn't exactly a painting, and in my humble opinion, not exactly art. But it's impossible to deny that this art object changed the world of art. Marcel Duchamp, a Frenchman, a Dadaist, who moved to New York in 1915. Dadaists are a group of artists, poets, and philosophers who emerged during World War I as a reaction to its horrors. Their idea was simple and tough. If European culture, with its Bach and Goethe, led to trenches and gas attacks, then this culture is mortally ill. So to hell with all its rules, to hell with its beauty, reason, traditions, art, and morality. We reject all of it. We will mock, provoke, and break. The very word Dada was chosen at random from a dictionary. According to one version, they pointed a finger at the first French word they saw, and it turned out to be Dada, a child's hobby horse. Perfect nonsense, just like everything else that came from their pen. Duchamp is the most intelligent of the Dadaists, neither loud nor rowdy. Precise, ironic, with a subtle sense of humor. By 1917, he had already created several provocative works. For example, a bicycle wheel on a stool, which he called a sculpture, as a test run for an extremely radical idea. What if you just take a ready-made object instead of creating it yourself? So, I call myself an artist. I take a chair, break one of its legs, I give it some meaningful name, let's say, the balance of the world. And there you have art. It may look like I just broke something, but I actually created an image and got people thinking. By the way, I made up that example just to illustrate. Don't focus on it. It's only to help you understand the idea. So please don't judge me too harshly. And in April 1917, Duchamp goes to the J.L. Mott Iron Works plumbing store on Fifth Avenue in New York. He buys the most ordinary factory-made urinal there for $6. He turns it on its side. He signs it with black paint. R. Mott, 1917. A pseudonym, a reference to the store owner's last name and a comic book character. He gives the work the title Fountain and submits it to the exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in New York. Here's an important detail. This society proclaimed, no jury, no rejections. We accept the work of anyone who pays a $6 fee. And Duchamp was also on the board of this society. And he decided to test them to see if there really were no restrictions by using such a base object, perhaps the least elevated thing ever created by man. And the jury refused. Despite their own promises, they said, this is not art, this is a mockery. Duchamp slammed the door in protest and left the board, and the fountain itself got lost somewhere. The original disappeared without a trace. All the current fountains in museums around the world are later replicas made by the artists from the 50s and 60s when Duchamp became famous and started ordering copies of his work from the same factories. Only one photograph by photographer Alfred Stieglitz remains from the original, and it shows that very inscription. 1917. But the idea didn't die. It seemed too tempting to many would-be artists, and it started to spread around the world. Marcel Duchamp proclaimed the same idea with his bold experiment. He said, anyone becomes an artist if they call a certain object art. You create an artistic pile, point at it, call it about calories, and you're an artist. I just invented that. It doesn't exist. Soon, another artist. Manzoni did pretty much the same thing, sealing his excrement in cans, which now cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'll definitely talk about that too, so subscribe so you don't miss it. In other words, now you not only don't have to make what's depicted look like reality or depict something recognizable, you don't even have to lift a finger. Actually, no, you still have to lift a finger. You need to point at the object to declare it as art. This idea was called ready-made, from the English already made, and it opened such a huge Overton window that the art world is still dealing with the consequences. After Duchamp, it became possible to call yourself an artist without knowing how to draw. You can become an artist by taping a banana to a wall. Hello, Maurizio Cattelan. The auction price is $6.2 million in 2024. You can preserve a shark in formaldehyde in a glass box and sell it for $12 million Damien Hirst. You can put your own blood into a head mold and sell it as a self-portrait. Mark Quinn. That's why you so often see something completely incomprehensible around you, but it's called art. Among all this, there are sometimes real treasures, but unfortunately, they are extremely rare. Stay with me to learn how to recognize them at first glance. I'll be honest, this idea seems rather doubtful to me. It opened the door to art for a huge army of charlatans who can't do anything except pose at press conferences. The modern art market is 90% built on this idea, and it often looks less like art and more like a pyramid scheme with big names and art dealers acting as stockbrokers. But honesty is honesty. If we consider the fountain as a turning point, and there's simply no better way to understand the patterns of the art world, then after it, painting and art in general split into two worlds. One world is made up of those who create things with their hands, who write, sculpt, draw, photograph, or craft. And the second world is made up of those who point their finger and say, this is now art. And sometimes the second world is now worth tens of times more than the first. Whether this is good or bad is an open question. Write in the comments what you think. Is this the fullest possible creative freedom or a dead end path that pollutes the very idea of art? But the fact itself is undeniable. The ready-made emerged and completely changed the rules of the game. And it happened thanks to the upside-down urinal. I'm preparing a separate big video about Duchamp. There will be Dadaism and his chess career. Duchamp actually gave up painting in the middle of his life and became a professional chess player. The story about how he worked at the New York Public Library will be interesting, so subscribe. Let's sum up, friends. Here are our 10 paintings, 10 steps spanning almost 500 years, from 1428 to 1917. From a flat icon on the wall of a Florentine church to an upside-down urinal in a New York gallery. From a craftsman who was paid by the day for each square meter of painted wall to an artist who pointed at a store-bought item and earned museum status or millions from it. Each next step was only possible because the previous one had already been taken. Without the perspective of Masaccio, there would be no Masaccio, a friend of Leonardo. Without Poussin's rules, Manet would have nothing to break. Without Seurat and Cézanne, Picasso wouldn't exist. Without Picasso, Kandinsky wouldn't exist. Without Kandinsky, Malevich would have seemed odd to everyone. Friends, I created this channel to tell you about art in a simple and engaging way. I love doing this. And every new video is my little project for which I need to build an interesting narrative, sometimes select up to 500 photos, arrange them correctly, and add captions. It's a huge amount of work, but quality is more important to me than quantity. I'll keep doing this, but your support would be really helpful to me. Please become a channel member here on YouTube, or even sign up for even the smallest membership on Boosty or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. Let's create the most knowledgeable art community in the world. And thank you for watching.